I'll give a very quick introduction to Jonathan, then the 2-minute meditation to see how these questions land and what might emerge, what wants to be spoken to after the meditation. But it's a real pleasure. Many thanks to Jonathan for his time. I've known Jonathan for a good 10 years or more, and he has a teaching position at Trondheim University in Norway in leadership and organizational development. He's editor-in-chief at Integral Review, so in terms of integral theory and philosophy, he's deeply steeped in those traditions. And then he has consulting work, consulting brand, Center for Transformative Leadership, and has a new online learning content platform, which you'll probably refer to. And yes, so it's been a fantastic pleasure to work with Jonathan. So we've worked on a good number of client projects together. And in particular, Jonathan sort of represents for me the community of people working in complexity sciences and anthropological principles in narratives and the developmental psychology school, which don't always actually meet on the same terms. So anyhow, that's a deep appreciation, and I've had a great time working with Jonathan. But so with that, and thanks again, everybody, for those introductions. And Jonathan, over to you.
Thanks, John. First of all, thanks for the invitation and for hosting me. And thanks for the introductions you guys gave. That really helps orient me to where might I start and where could we go. That was really helpful. I'll say a few. One, I'm in Trondheim, Norway, so I'm the farthest north of anybody here. It hasn't been dark for 2 weeks, and it won't be dark again till the end of July. So we're that far north. I'm going to take off on one of the comments or questions I heard about the relation of spiritual practice to developmental theory. And I'm going to start there because if I was to give, and for me, I have a history degree, kind of what is the historical context for me of how I look at this subject. It was really when I dropped out of studying physics and philosophy at the University of British Columbia, I suddenly found myself being very disillusioned with the intellectual realm and wanting to connect with something spiritual. And so took up a spiritual practice and engaged in a lot of that self-development work throughout my 20s and now on for decades now. Along the way, then I went back to school in my early 30s with this intention that how can I find a bridge between what I've learned through spiritual practice with something that I could maybe make a living and be practical in the world with, because I was pig farming and dump truck driving and carpentry and these kind of things. So there was a big disconnect between those worlds for me. So when I came to a master's degree in organizational leadership, and in that ran into Robert Keegan's work and Bill Torbert's work and started to get exposed to this notion of development, it very much aligned with or gave a more granular language to start talking about my own experience of consciousness development in some broad way. So notions of evolutionary consciousness, developmental consciousness, I realized it was a big, broad term, but there were some people who were talking about it with some research behind it, some distinctions that were useful. And that was my kind of entry point in the mid-90s into this. And then from there, it's kind of like somebody said, I've been here for a long time studying this and learning how much I don't know about it. So I think this is a large part of any of these kind of things. When you really dive deep and look around, you find out how much more is going on than you ever imagined. So, and I heard reference, for instance, to Lelou and his, what I say is just an adaptation of Claire Graves' spiral dynamics work, and Don Beck and Chris Cowan's adaptation, and Ken Wilber's interface with that. I want to make a distinction here, that I came into this where there were a lot of these models, and it was when Ken Wilber was starting the Integral Institute, and I was hanging around with people involved in this, which eventually led to a parallel thing, which led to the Journal Integral Review. But a lot of these were looking in a very holistic way about how does the self develop, how does ego develop, or in these other cases, how do whole cultural memes evolve and develop? How do organizations or teams develop? And of course, you can see that people talk about this in different disciplines and in different ways. But a lot of these models then really try to kind of integrate a lot of things in a very holistic way and say there's some really broad characteristics we can say about what it is to go from being less mature and less complex to more mature and more complex. And then, as somebody alluded to, of course, the growth to goodness fallacy comes in very quickly. And the achiever mindset says, yes, I understand intellectually this map, and therefore I must be at the top, and that's a good thing. And then I think we've probably all encountered and or gone through, I can say this for myself, where you go, yeah, that's a good thing, I want that. And then eventually you start to learn that there's more going on. It's not as simple as saying that, let's say, bigger is better. So you start to learn that fit for purpose, the ability to be present to the other in their fullness and engage in a mutually beneficial way. Now, that can be informed, because somebody talked about teaching. If you understand what is a sequence within a given domain, what are the steps and building blocks in learning something, and you can see where a person is in their learning, you can say, oh, what might be the next ideal thing that would really hook the dopamine in their brain and get them super curious and interested because it's a natural next step for them. So what I came across more later, and this is where, I don't know if that's where we first connected, John, or not, but was through the world of Kurt Fischer's dynamic skill theory, Michael Common's model of hierarchical complexity, and how Theo Dawson and Lectica has kind of built on and woven those things together into a set of practices, models, and assessment tools that understands development in what I would say is a very different way. And this gets to what are the distinctions and limitations. The challenge with the holistic ego development and integrative, encompassing everything models is the broader the concept, the fuzzier the construct. So it becomes harder to measure with precision. And I've seen really robust dissertation research analyzing 1,000 sentence completion tests and showing that, yes, there is something sequentially happening, but 75% of it is noise when you try and measure it. There's many other things going on. And so you start to see the limitations of some of those ways of trying to measure distinctions that we see in reality, but are often hard to kind of pin down. So what skill theory and Lectica have done is tried to look much more specifically at this notion that how can we assess a given performance, and how does that performance, which we know will vary according to context, according to relational dynamics, according to the time of day for us, whatever, our performance will fluctuate. But it's also, and this was Kurt Fischer's brilliance, of integrating Piaget's notions of epistemological development, assimilation, accommodation, equilibration, these kind of things, with behaviorist understanding that we are conditioned by the environment. We are always responding to the environment. So skills are looked at then as something that is always a performance in a context. and evolves in domain-specific areas. So you can have skills for reflective judgment, or decision-making, or the physics of energy, or pedagogical things, or ecological thinking. There are building blocks that lead to more complex and nuanced understandings of a given domain. I'm going to stop for a moment because I think I talk too much. And then I think I would invite any commentary or questions at this point, because I've got some slides I could share to give a little more nuance to this. But I think it would be good to just stop there and see what the response is to what I've laid out. Rufus.
What couple of things? One, just one second. Sorry, I have my son with me. So first of all, just thank you also for sharing the personal kind of journey. It's always amazing to hear where people kind of came from. So thank you. And I look forward to actually seeing the slide. I think it would be great, you know, to see those. I suppose I have a couple of questions just at the moment. So let's start with maybe classic intelligence testing, which was that we took a bunch, you know, actually, if you know,
Well, if you read Zach Stein's dissertation, you see that, and Binet and these people were actually trying to look at how to help people who struggled in life.
Yes, yes. But what I wanted to come to on though is they were giving people a battery. They weren't like attached at the beginning, like there's one measure of intelligence. They were, let's just look at different performance that people are doing. And particularly Binet obviously was very much committed to helping people in that way. And then out of that, you did factor analysis. You said, okay, we've given people speech tests. We've given them other ones which involve, I don't know, simple planning, or something else involves recognizing patterns and shape. And what was the kind of, you do a kind of statistical analysis and you get a bunch of factors that explain this performance across different tests. Because in one world, right, you could have someone who's just amazing at talking and is terrible at pattern recognition. But what obviously turns out, roughly, is there's quite a lot of correlation.
Or my favorite example is I went to the New Comp once for a football game, and I remember seeing Luis Suarez take, you know, a 40-yard pass and in the air, take it on his chest and make the perfect pass as he turned his body. Now, he has high level of performance and skill there, kinesthetically, but emotion regulation, no, that was pretty low. You know, he goes and bites other players.
Yeah, so we kind of point, right, which is to say, let's say what we came to is then, okay, you could be, that came up, you know, the classic thing that people still debate, that there's G, there's this intelligence thing. So we come in this other area of, let's say, development. So everyone might agree, okay, you can have really smart psychopaths. You know, this is the classic example. You know, you have someone who's really like intelligent in some way, doing what they want, but they don't have any kind of moral development or empathy or
Anders
whatever.
Breivik here in Norway.
Yeah, right. So you have these examples. And we even then say in ego event, we can see people who have kind of somehow super smart in some domain, but they're not smart in this other domain. What I guess I'm wondering about, and I mean, is that you just mentioned, so let's even say in this area, you said, oh, you can got these different domain specific skills, but what's the correlation between them? For example, in the curve, you know, like just like G, you might say, oh, well, there's all these different domains,
Right.
But is this ability of kind of complex, you know, hierarchical complexity or whatever it is, how much does it differ across domains? And how would we then classify domains? Because what would be really useful out of that is we'd start being able to say, okay, there's actually about 8, you know, crudely 8 different domains. And why again, like just the next step of that is we could start having a little bit of a map of what does evolution, I'd like to hear is, I don't even want to say evolution, not even maybe development, but let's say what's the map of that domain. Now I like this analogy, like you can have a map of the world. It doesn't mean that like going to go to France, to go to France, I have to have gone to Germany first. You know, you can have a map where you just know where you can move around the map without having to get into whether there's a hierarchy or something in the map in some way. But
Sure.
still, my point would be, what kind of breakdown into those domains do we have? And I'm getting quite detailed already with my questioning, so I'm aware that I wonder
So
whether we
I
should come
know
back
some of this
to-
we'll have to talk about on Tuesday night.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Rufus is doing the electrical training, by the way,
Yeah.
girls, guys. That's a reference to a training program.
Yeah.
But maybe we come back to the slides, because that is a very detailed question that maybe should come at the end. So I'm just flagging.
Yeah, well, I'll give a little short answer and then I'll see, because I think, and then Wilbur talked about this, you know, the cognitive line, as it's called, is often the one that's seen as the leading line, because it seems to be something about whether it's a general intelligence or something that allows us to learn and grow in domain-specific areas of performance. So there is some kind of undercurrent, and I think what Theo has tried to do with Lectica is tap into, and she did, you know, she took 700 of Kohlberg's studies and 300 of King and Kitchener's and 200 of somebody else's, and looked at what was in common in these domain-specific methods and models of measuring the evolution of people's complexity of relating to morality or reflective judgment or what their conception of the good life was, and found there was a common denominator underneath that has to do with what she talked about as the core structure. So how do we just identify distinct factors? So to that part of your question, you know, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? You can, and at least in my mind, mentally, you can ask endless questions and make endless numbers of distinctions. Then you have to ask the question, what is that in service of? How much granularity is useful in a given context? So how many domains are important to identify? There's no right answer to it, I think. Other comments or questions? No. Come on, gotta give me something more to work with.
It's nothing to work with. Sorry I came late. It's very nice to meet you, Jonathan, and just really excited to hear of your research. So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Boris, we did a very quick introduction with a question to each of the people here. Have you heard of developmental psychology, and do you have a question that you're holding?
I have, and I do.
Okay.
If I can frame it, I'm particularly interested in the intersection between how these competencies help to create a better world. So the interaction between inner work and social change. And I think, you know, we're looking at sort of meta maps in terms of all these inner competencies, and we just have limited time and very limited resources. And so, you know, like within the next decade, which ones are the key ones to make the change that we need? Is there a specific axis to restrict the field of the growth? You know,
get right to the heart of the matter. No, and you make me think of the process we went through in the inner development goals, developing the 23 competencies or skills in 5 domains. So that was a long process that a lot of us put a lot of input into, and all of us involved feel very, how would I say, satisfied and dissatisfied with the result, because we're painfully aware of the limitations of that list and the way it's conceived and done, and yet at the same time see that, of course, it doesn't mean these aren't important. So I'm mindful of the time whipping
Jonathan,
by too, and I thought maybe I should share something.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, exactly. It's good to sort of cycle around, have these questions, but let them.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I'm going to share 2 things. I'm going to share my other screen. So now if you see me looking funny, it's because I've got my reading glasses on to talk to you, and I'm trying to get something on this monitor way over there. Okay. So here is, I'm going to share the second, come on, there we go. And you'll ignore all the green stuff on it. That was for another project. So this is one of Theo's latest projects, these skill maps. This is an example of trying to take a domain of, you know, what is performance made up of, what are sub skills, And so she's talked about this in terms of, in this case, it's self-mastery. Well, there's things related to thought and behavior and biases and values and learning and emotions. Well, in emotions, we need to learn emotion. There's emotions related to learning. There's regulating our emotions. There's simple awareness of emotions, and these break down into smaller and smaller things. And the goal of this kind of mapping, or let's see here, we have one on collaborative capacity. What does it take to collaborate with others? Well, you have to be able to take and seek perspectives. Self-mastery or self-regulation comes in, communication comes in. You can think of contextual thinking, decision-making, perspective coordination. These are just some simple examples of the way you can get into granularity. And the purpose of this has been that in trying to support people's growth and development, what they found was that the learning model, the VCOLs, the virtuous cycle of learning, was being applied at way too abstract a level. We'd give people an assignment, read this book and practice this for the next year, and nobody would really follow up on it. But when you get out to being really granular about skills out at the periphery here, you could build micro vehicles that people could practice in the moment.
Could you mention what a VCOL is, Jonathan?
Yeah, virtuous cycle of learning. So it's modeled after it's a generic type of approach, but it says you set a goal or see something you want to learn, you seek or get some information related to it, you apply it and you reflect on it, and then revise the goal because now you've learned something and you try again in another way. And this is how children learn to walk. They may fail 1,000 times, but they're motivated as hell to keep going. So speaking of kids, now I got to move my things around a little bit here. You should be seeing a blank screen at the moment. Okay, got rid of that. And okay, just a second. Okay, so Kurt Fisher, this is a way to talk about what did Fisher see, and then we're starting. You can see the dot there is level 6. Levels 1 through 5 are these 2 tiers. Basically, an infant is born into the world with a central nervous system and skin and organs and all this, and it right away starts interacting with the world and learning how to control reflexes in its body. Learn how to suck the thumb, learn how to grasp, learn how to grab things. All these things are this reflex level. And then you get into this whole tier with different levels within it of sensory motor skills. So then you start learning to crawl and walk and run and all these kind of things. At some point, and I like Zach Stein had a good example of this. You imagine you're putting your kids to bed, and at first, it takes every bit of bandwidth they have to brush their teeth and not smear toothpaste all over their face. And little by little with practice, they get better at it. And then they go to put their pajamas on, and at first, the bottoms are on their head, and eventually they learn how to do this. And all the time, while they're practicing these sensory motor skills, they're taking up all their cognitive bandwidth. They hear their parents using this word, it's bedtime. And eventually, they habituate and kind of make system 1 normalize kind of automatic routines for these sensory motor skills so that they chunk those skills under a representation. Oh, it's bedtime. It means I brush my teeth and pull my pajamas on and get into bed. And so language starts to represent a highly chunked set of sensory motor experiences and reflexes. Those become automatic. We don't have to think about them. And I gather John's talking to his daughter or something and not me.
Yeah, I'm talking to my daughter, sorry.
Okay, say hi to them.
Okay, thanks.
So we start there. We start where language starts to represent physical sensory motor experience. And you get these single representations, but then you to get 2 representations, you map them. And somehow this is a little more complex. And of course, eventually you take and make a system of cognitive representations in language. It's more complex now, but it's still within representations. But eventually this cycles around, you get a system of systems of representations, which becomes a single abstraction. And I'm going to show an example of this in a little bit. And so then you go from single abstractions to mapping abstractions, which is primarily formal operational logic, if-then thinking. It tends to come on stream at 10, 12 years old. You can, another good example, if you don't teach a young child 3 or 4 years old arithmetic because their minds are magical and mythical, but at 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, you can teach arithmetic because the structure of their cognition allows for this kind of mapping of principles so you can do arithmetic, but you don't teach them algebra because that requires the abstraction of taking any number for x. So at this point at level 10, you're taking two systems of representations as abstractions and making a causal relationship. So you have if-then thinking. And this is where the majority of the population functions. And then a minority of the population gets into systems of systems. So level 11 in this model, you start to get small group dynamics, family systems theory are examples of this, where you can cognitively hold multiple abstractions at once and start to notice the importance of the relationships between them, and that it's not linear. There's shades of gray, there's multiple considerations at play. And then eventually, kind of at the very far end, are systems of systems, or level 12, which is like you get to principles that derive entire systems of thinking. So now, to give an example of this, this comes from the Lexical Dictionary. The word truth. Now, I should say something. The Lexical Dictionary is a project that Theo has been done for a long time. My wife interned with her for a year and was working on this as well. They've looked at performances in that they have a database of 50 or 60,000 ways in which, for instance, you ask children to reflect on different scenarios, or people in leadership positions to reflect on different scenarios. And you have written cases, performances of how did people think about things. And you can look with that kind of theoretical model at when should certain language come on stream, and you can look empirically at where do words first get used in a meaningful way. A 5-year-old can say, my mom's a psychotherapist, but their understanding of what the word psychotherapist means is not real in a sense. It's just assimilated in an abstract way. So the word truth comes on stream as a representation of sensory motor reality. So what I said with, like an 8-year-old, truth, what is truth is this is a wooden table, or, it's a one-to-one correspondence between a conception and a physical object. So it's this mapping of the concept and the thing. But then you see there's a C's and D's and A's and B's in there. So Lexic has gotten more granular and says, of course, within each of these levels, our cognition works in, we go through a journey, we enter into a new stage and it's new to us and it's not very nuanced yet. So then what we can see is truth emerges kind of later in level 7. And towards the end of level 7, you also have the concept, well, that's not the truth. That's wrong, right? But then a system of representations of construct is really the truth. And then 8b, truth when you start to see you're linking more things. It's true under certain conditions. There's more concepts being constellated here. Or 8c, truth even, truth unless, or a kind of truth. And you see the the formalism of it starts to break down. And then at level 9, where we got into abstractions, you have this word truthful, which is an abstract concept of many instances of something being true or the truth. And then you get into finding the truth, the whole truth, truthfully. And then you get into concepts like ugly truth and a grain of truth, which are more this mapping of abstractions. Yeah, this is the same thing. This is just a bit about class. That's the basic. There's, I think, 1.5 million terms in the dictionary. And what it does is it's not individual words. It's like here, truth or truthfulness, truthiness, truthful, finding the truth. It can be 2 or up to 3 word phrases. And they look at how do these occur in this large empirical database. How do they, where do they actually start to occur? Where do we see evidence of performance? Now, one of the things that was quite interesting in this, let's see, no, the one is, yeah, just to give you an idea of, because CLASS stands for the Computerized Electrical Assessment System. So Thea had 25 years of working on this, and she has records now from 1955 from Kohlberg on up to the present. So massive empirical data set. And the computer taught them things because it started to show, first of all, a level of granularity. A given performance, linguistically, how we talk, is not all high-level language. We're primarily using much simpler constructs and linking them together in certain ways. And you see here this, I don't know how much detail you can see, but basically, well, there's a pointer thing if I do this right. There we go. Here at the earlier levels, you know, we're seeing all these things, and as you get further up in the electrical levels, you just see less proportion of a performance. But what you also can see, this is where it gets down to a 20th of a level, very granular, but this is the most fun. So what happened was, you know, who are the geeky people that want to take these kind of assessments, and who is the community that was for early adopters? It was the integral community. And so they had all these kind of performances that use jargon in a way that when they would score it as people, they would make attributions or inferences about the complexity of how this person was thinking, and they would kind of attribute maybe more complexity than was there. And when the computer started scoring these things, scores started coming down. And what they struggled with this for a while until they realized that, what's going on is people have, like a 5-year-old saying, my mom's a psychotherapist, read Ken Wilber or Lelou or whatever, and started using all this cool language and sound really great.
So,
But
Jonathan,
the underlying structure of how they're using it was actually not as complex as the terms were really meant to be. John?
just the vertical axis, sorry to interrupt you, but could you clarify what is the vertical axis on this? So you've got the...
I gotta look really carefully here because I have my reading glasses on. I believe this is like the chart here, or here you would see, you know,
Density.
what is at this level, right? 9 or 6A, B, the really early levels of linguistic performance that are in any language that we're using even now. There's a more of that kind of language than there is of the higher level. So I believe the vertical axis is just showing in a performance that, where are we at here, like 6B, okay. All the language tends to be in 6B. There isn't a range. So as you get higher levels of performance on the horizontal axis, what you see is there is more distribution across here, and you get this red line curve eventually.
Okay, yeah.
So that's some slides. Now what kind of questions does that bring up? Mark.
Sorry, yes, thank you. So just on the last part of the people using the jargon to sound, deep, but who are shallow. So what was the method? Because so you have this algorithm, right, that is able to pick on certain, it's a natural language processing or whatever, and then you had to adapt to, like, what was the method to detect and to lower?
Well, there's a long method. So just like, I've sat at Suzanne Cook-Greuter on her deck with Lovinger's scoring manual and looking at, and it's the same in the FOLA, we had Kohlberg's scoring manual. So people started out looking at what are the differences in how people talk about things and what do those differences tell us? How can we categorize and look for patterns in them? And ego development did the same thing. You're looking at, do people just have simple sentences, or do they say and this, or do they say or that, or how do they link terms and so on? So you're looking at what perspectives do they take, for instance. So this is looking, if I was to make a simplistic characterization, at a deeper underlying structure of how language represents cognitive processes or epistemological structures, and is mapping that through how it's represented in language. And they are very clearly aware and explicit about how sharp and precise they can be and the absolute limits. They're measuring a specific construct. They're not trying to measure everything and anything. Rufus.
I'll just check if other people have questions for a moment. Just sit. Okay, well, I have one practical question at the beginning, because I've looked quite a bit, is this there's two different kind of data Letica will have, I mean, let alone other people. You mentioned that Theo's been collecting data, for example, Kohlberg's research, or all these stuff. I've been reading, I mean, I haven't read all of Theo's stuff. I've read quite a few of the papers. Is this material available online openly? Like, it's not even the Letica core stuff, because I get that's maybe specific to him, but I'm just meaning the historical, like, hey, having all of Kohlberg's source interviews or whatever available would be really valuable, or Cook-Greuter's scoring manual openly available online, like just this material available. I mean, another example which takes in a slightly different area is just like spiral, like Wilbur constantly makes these references in his books. I keep going on about this to like, oh, spiral dynamics database says X, and like their database doesn't even exist anymore online. I think they've disbanded spiral dynamics. Their data never seems to have got put online as far as I can tell. I might be wrong, but I just think there would also be a massive benefit for this field that there was more
open source sharing.
Yeah.
I think it's a good question, and it's a complicated one for many reasons. I think there's issues of proprietary intellectual property that lead to commercial interests that has some role in it.
Yeah.
There's also, how do people actually understand this? So were you in the FOLA that I took, John, or no? I think you were just in the lab. No, but when I took the FOLA, we were given Kohlberg's scoring manual and asked to go do an interview and use the manual to score it. And just to begin to understand how to make sense or use of this is enormous amount of work. Scholarly references.
Yeah, just to take an example, just a list of Kohlberg's, like, you can find like a few examples, famously, the pharmacist, who has to steal the drug. But if you actually want a list of all of his, what were all of his moral conundrums, as it were, I'm just saying, I don't understand why that stuff, like if Theo's collected all of Kohlberg's material, it's already proprietary.
Well, I don't think what's proprietary, I think, is simply that Theo has taken the performances of how people responded to those questions and scored them with a system that allows her to do longitudinal research and also compare different models and systems of measurement and what she was looking at. And there are papers that you can find academically online. They are available and open. And I could share through John. I have a link to a Dropbox.
That would be great. That's my question. It's like, I'm not even trying to say people are doing it or not. I'm saying I am looking for particularly, I guess, the actual score, like the kind of questions and the scoring system, at least for those that are like Kohlberg, you know,
Well,
I get that many of the other ones, they don't kind of make it eventable, like, you know, the other integral group that, but yeah, yeah, so let's not get into too much of that, but it's more just like, or, you know, spiral dynamics data, you know, just be fascinating to have cultural,
I just read the two guys' biography, or the very short one of Claire Graves, and it was great because it talked a lot about the robust rigor of his method in the 50s and 60s, and so you hear those stories, then you get more of an appreciation for the model. I know, like, people like Dave Stone will just slag it off as, you know, astrology or mumbo jumbo, but if you see the robustness and rigor with which he actually gathered data, now it doesn't mean that we can't see limitations to those methods or limitations to the cultural norms within which that data was gathered and how that might need to be tested in other contexts and so on. And this is what people have been doing going forward, is saying, given what is there and what we see as the limits of it, what else can we learn and do? And I'm mindful of the time.
Yeah, exactly. Just 8 minutes to go. Yeah, so mindful of wrapping up gradually.
So this is just meant to be a teaser.
Indeed, yes. Hopefully, the beginning of continued collaboration and landing it in the Life Itself community.
But I can certainly send John, maybe I probably wouldn't dump the whole list on, but some select good articles that would be worth reading.
We don't mind the whole list, just to say, for me. I would happily have the whole list.
But you'll get it because you're in the FOLA anyway, so you'll get it.
But that Conti, in FOLA, Conti says I'm not allowed to distribute anything. So
yeah, I know. Well, it's partly because they've paid money for
I'm not critiquing
the
it.
open sourcing in academic world and the way major journals need to protect their, you know, business, basically. Mark.
Yeah, that's you, Mark.
Yeah, maybe I'll go for another question. I'm thinking about the temporalities involved in these measurements. So these phase changes or the developmental changes, you could accelerate them, obviously, with some programs, and I guess people develop trainings and maybe can measure whether you've kind of developed. And I just wanted to guess, to have an estimate of, you know, how much you can do, like what time it can take. And you know, here we have residencies that can last a few weeks. You have a lot of practices and trainings. And so I was wondering, are there even things that could be measurable in that context? And maybe text analysis you provide have some way to try something.
I think a couple of quick things. There's a really good podcast on the Future of Learning podcast with Zach Stein, who was one of the founders of Lectica, and Mary Helen Immortio Yang, who's doing really cool neuroscience research. And they're talking about these kind of things in a way. And it also is relevant to one of the studies my wife was helping Theo with at the time. They were looking at this school. It was called the Rainbow School. And Theo has this on Medium. There's articles about that school in particular. But what they showed was, if a school is adopting a more formative assessment model that is basically giving kids feedback that helps them understand what's the next thing to learn, that had the impact of accelerating their development, so that kids in that school that were in like grade 9 or 8 were at like almost college level, like high school graduate level, compared to norms in other mainstream school systems. So there are ways you can educate that take advantage of children's natural learning. I think primarily, as Ken Robinson showed in his, you know, TED Talk on education, it sucks the life out of kids' natural ability to learn, and therefore they don't grow in the way they could. Joe.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know exactly how to put this, so I'm just going to say something broad and just because I'm very curious to learn more. So when you talk about seeing the systems of systems, I'm wondering what the next levels could be. So if we have systems of systems, do we look for patterns within those systems of systems? And then if we have patterns, do we look for recognition within the patterns? And how does that map on to a stage of development?
Yeah. The best place to look would be in some of Michael Common's later writings, because he talks about, what's level 13 and 14 and 15 look like, cross-paradigmatic and these kind of things, and he tries to give examples of them. So he's mapped that out a little bit. What Theo has said is, we can intellectually imagine those, but you get to the same thing you see in Torbert or Cook-Greuter's notions of being construct aware. What happens is the ability of language to represent cognition starts to be highly limited. So you don't find linguistic performances that score. I think there's maybe one performance that the computer now scores at level 12. Before that, there were a bunch of us that had level 12 scores, but now, no, because this is just, you start to load more relationship to language and pack more into it at much later levels. And so language becomes a poorer and poorer proxy for what's going on in cognition. So it's fun to fantasize and imagine. And Terry O'Fallon does the same thing in that in her meta-aware tiers, she's seeing nuances and distinctions that she sees as different than going from strategist to alchemist or ironist. She sees a different kind of progression and different nuances of things there that gives you some granularity of what might be going on, of how attention is moving and what it's holding and what consciousness is aware of. And you can say you're scoring things there, but that's a whole nother issue of the construct validity of that and the measurement validity and how, if language can really do that. You'll see something coming in the coming weeks or months about that in integral review.
Just a heading, if anybody else, I have one heading, but Yogi, did you have something? No, I just saw you move. Just very quickly in the last couple of minutes, I guess, curious to name some of the practical applications, because for me, what's interesting is that Lectica came very much from the educational field and the sort of Vygotsky proximal zone of development that Jonathan was talking about. So there's a real practical, generative, using testing to know where you want to go next is a very generative rather than a high stakes. So Theo speaks a lot about the high stakes testing that failed in the past.
What I should do is put in the chat, because so one of the people that worked with Kurt Fischer was Mike Mascolo, and he basically is the developmental theorist I've learned the most from lately. And I got him to do one of these growth that matters events for the inner development goals. This is like a year and a half ago. So I'll put the link to this in the chat here. And one of the things he says is this thing about, learning happens, or development happens, learning and development, pretty much the same thing. It happens in the middle of everything. It happens when things break down, there's conflict. So he talks about thesis, antithesis, conflict, and synthesis. And the book's Psychotherapy is a Developmental Process that he and Michael Bassishes did. I found on Wikipedia, on Robert Keegan's page, where they talk about critiques of his theory. Keegan says, his evolving self, and that's interesting, but it's not. He says the best developmental theory is Michael Bassish's and Michael Mascolo's, and references this book. So it happens in the middle of everything. It happens when things break down, and it happens in relationship. And it's in these micro moments where we go from experience and action, where we're predicting and testing our predictions neurologically in the world. And then when we're getting feedback from that, and we step back and reflect on that. And so we're trying to build scalable online applications of kind of integrating Theo's VCOL model with Mike Mascolo's model to direct people's attention to understanding. We started with building emotional resilience. How do people get triggered and their consciousness and performance constricts? And how do we help them become more sensitive to that, nuanced and aware of it, uncover the fear underneath it and reframe that fear as curiosity? So, and then the cool thing is, we're testing that out in the leader development program for the Roman Catholic Church this summer.
So yeah, very practical offering from Jonathan.
Yeah, and it's less about assessment. This is the thing. We talked about, you know, scales and assessment. It's less about that. The assessments are always only meant to serve where is the growth edge for people? Where is that zone of proximal development to really work into? And so we're trying to help people tune into that in their own way and get the dopamine hit from being curious about their own experience.
So yeah, that's a great note to wrap up on. Jonathan, I know you're at a conference, you're at a very interesting conference.
No, now it's done.
Oh, it's done. Okay, okay. But I don't know if anybody...
It's finishing now.
Okay, but if there were any people who wanted to stay on a couple more minutes, and if Jonathan is available, but yeah, we've hit the hour, so anybody that needs to drop off, of course, yeah, thanks so much for checking in and being here. But otherwise, yeah, welcome to the after party. And so, Jonathan, how are you for time?
Yeah, well, I said my goodbyes to Matt Salveson at the conference there and took off, and I think they're breaking now and going off, so I'm not needing to get back.
Okay.
I just have to go grade exams now, so I can hold off on that for a little bit.
Right, cool. Yeah, well, so yeah, whoever wants to drop off at any time, obviously, great to have you with us. And Rufus, it sounds like you had anybody else?
Yeah, I have more. I have definitely more. So I think we could even set up maybe a smaller session. I know I'm doing the FOLA, but there might be other things. Well, I guess there's a whole bunch here that come up, partly because it's difficult to know sometimes outside of Lectica. You know, I came across Lectica quite a few years ago, but like the website, like I don't know, the phone state was kind of almost by chance. Like, I have to look back at the site and see, hey, there's this course coming up. You know, well, I guess I'm just outflowing first is that there's this kind of skills theory, the Neo-Piagetian synthesis, you might call it, right? Fisher was the epitome of, and I guess my feeling is if you kind of had these dimensions, like this waking up, cleaning up, growing up, showing up, and we probably would add another one because basically this is like smartening up or something, like this kind of like the interactions of these dimensions isn't very clear, right? But that's like a nice, very simple dimensional one.
And I would say the cleaning up is the one we're trying to start with, because we see that's where the most need is.
Yeah, well, and it gets in the way of everything else, right? In a way, like, well, I mean, I would say cleaning up, waking up. But, you know, like a classic example I came to at the beginning, like, there's a piece on our little forum was, you know, I kept asking this years, you know, when I said first, I only came across integral very late, like a few years ago in my life, relatively. For some reason, no one gave it to me when I needed it 20 years ago. But hey, you know, let's say you have the Wilber-Kunz matrix. An immediate question is like, you know, I think it's one of the things I think is a real breakthrough about that is, okay, hey, kind of waking up is distinct from growing up in some sense. You know, you can have a real, you know, this classic example will be used of Ram Dass's brother, you know, who kind of has an incredibly powerful waking up experience spiritually, but is basically convinced, you know, he's Jesus. And you interpret your waking up experience when you come back in Buddhist terms to the relative dimension from the ultimate. You've got this integration, like how do you frame the experience you've had back in the relative dimension? That would be the way the Buddhist terms put it. And so I think one of the massive insights was, hey, these are immanent dimensions. That whereas before there'd been this like the stacking, right? You know, you get more and more somehow smart, and then you get even more and more wise, and you kind of go from the spirit like this kind of stacked model. Then of course there's a kind of correlation question. You know, one of the questions in our forum I did dig out in the discussion forum is like, hey, isn't there a correlation matrix? Like, is it really the case you know, assuming, let's even debate about whether the growing up like sporadic colors even make sense. Let's just assume for a moment they do. That's a very dubious claim. You know, is it the case you can really get to teal and like still be in like Wilbur would call it like gross, right? You know, like
yeah, but now I want to interrupt there because this, you know, I spent 3 days with Don Beck 20 years ago taking that training, and it became very clear to me then that this is one of the, like Jennifer talks about in her book Mind Traps, we like simple stories.
right.
And so we say get to teal and then we'll be at teal. But the model of spiral dynamics is that we have all of these memes in us that are activated in different contexts.
Yes.
This could give us more agility that we maybe could, when necessary in a given context, actually activate that.
I got it. Let's call it, I always call it the licorice, whatever it was you bought, you know, that rock that you buy at the beach, which has multiple colors in it, you know, like you get, I get that. I'm not trying to be crude. Like my point simply was like, what I'm trying to tell in this is like, okay, you've got these, let's say different lines in that case. This was like the crudest, like simplest one. Like it was a real insight to say, hey, there are 2 different lines. That was the big, like there, for example, in very different areas. And then I'm asked the question, how do they interact? And then the kind of maps of these, I mean, what we're trying to do, right, is create, I kind of put it in the chat, but maps and rafts. We need an ontogenetic map. It's always wrong. It's never, the map is not the territory, the map, but it is a useful model in some ways. And then what we can think about is we're trying to have rafts that help us move around our map. But without a map, it's kind of difficult to know whether your raft's working, where you're going to the right place. And conversely, you know, like the you know, you only really want a map because you want to move around the map, you know, per se. So I guess that's why I still coming back to is maybe I just need to I'll keep reading the paper. So one of my specific questions there was like, what are these other domains? So let's say my sense reading Thorson, you know, and reading her papers and reading and seeing the Lexica stuff, was it obviously they're rightly cautious, like more like this is skills thing. So it's kind of a very enriched version of cognition, and it can relate to ego development, but it's not really very clear to me that, you know, like that it relates, for example, to waking up that much, that you could be really woken up and not very high on any skills. Ramana Maharishi doesn't have to have scored very highly in terms of his level of hierarchical complexity, you know, per se.
But that's a function of time and culture and language and these kind of things, and you know, what is important in a given context. And I think Zach Stein, you know, some of the talks he's been doing lately, he has a model or a way of talking about some of these different domains to try and map them, because there is something important about, like John sometimes and I've talked about, you know, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Well, what is true in terms of cognitive complexity and how skills develop and so on, that's one domain, but that's not the whole world.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
So all these things are there. The other thing that is important for me, you know, I came to integral theory 25 years or 27 years ago or something. And for me, it was a limited approximation of spiritual practice.
Yes.
So it's always keeping these things in perspective and context. Like you say, they are useful maps that give us distinctions. So I've been listening to Brené Brown's podcast a lot lately, and she's talking with a woman from South Africa named Susan David about emotional agility and the need to be able to have more refined language to name, like Eugene Genlin talked about, you know, what is the felt sense of our emotional experience at the moment? How do we give more granular nuance to that to actually say what we're experiencing, rather than saying some big undifferentiated thing, which she said, you know, we can say we're happy, sad, or pissed off. That's what the average person can say. They can name 3 things. So she said, how do you get more granularity? So in the same way, what you're talking about is a map can give you granularity so that you can understand, am I in a birch forest or a cedar forest? Am I in a big torrent river near the ocean, or am I in a small lake in the mountains?
Exactly. I mean, the analogy, I guess I keep using, I don't know why, yeah, it'll probably be this one. I just don't know what's happened to the podcast. I don't know if you know Jeffrey Martin in the Finders course.
Oh, I think Thomas Jordan told me about this.
The reason I go on about this guy, and I find it so interesting, and I keep bringing this up again and again and again with people, for me, is it's like this, and I guess the Piagetian stuff is like kind of less surprising because people worked on it for a century. But like Martin was like, okay, for me, and I'm just saying this for myself, is this, he's done the best map of waking up. And for me, it was kind of shocking because when you go and talk to him, he's like, oh, just not like, he kind of came, I mean, it doesn't really matter. You can listen to the podcast. I put the link, but he kind of like, for the analogy for me is he just went, no one had actually just gone out and said, okay, I'm going to systematically go and find people who, you know, you know, he came out, he went to Harvard and did his master's in stuff. You know, went to the, you know, California Institute of Integral Studies to do his PhD under Coombs. And, you know, like the point was just to be like, he was the first guy, it seems to me, who'd gone out systematically and spoken to people and said, okay, you've woken up according to your tradition. So not just my opinion, but your tradition says you're really woken up. Your tradition actually has a definition of waking up in some way, and you meet the, you know, kind of criteria. And I'm going to interview you and then try and like distinguish the kind of features of your waking up, and not from like, oh, just I feel one, but like, I'm going to start asking you for kind of phenomenological markers, like how's your memory performing? How's your emotional stuff? And end up with this map that, you know, I just think it's like, compared to like the gross, subtle, and, you know, okay, sure, the
Much
Buddhist
more
tradition,
distinguished.
yeah, but the Buddhist tradition has a load more, if you like, of the factors of its meditational path and stuff. There are a bunch of them in different traditions, but I'm just saying that like his one, it's much really end up with these locations, and then this kind of high, he's got this kind of now called the Martyr Matrix. But not only that, the cool thing was almost by accident, then he's like, oh, I got all these practices. He kind of had a map. He was looking kind of for the map, and then he got the raft because he was asked these people, and they'd start telling him, well, what were they doing when they woke up? You know, like, and then and ended up with quite surprising things for me in a way. You know, like I would say, you know, again, I would emphasize, I've done the course. You know, and again, he's not a guru. What I like about it is in that case, he's not like, I've got any other new method. I'm not, you know, telling you. I'm simply synthesizing into a scientific protocol this kind of cocktail, almost like a pharmaceutical. Like, I'm going to take the bunch of stuff that I've heard people say really works for waking up, and I'm going to put it together in a particular order and play around with that order to see what's really effective and collect data. And this to me is just like, you know, like this itself being like a semi-data driven approach, you know, semi-scientific, I'd say, approach to stuff is like, you know, itself shocking in these kind of areas. You know, I always use the example here of like Plum Village, which I live next to, which has, you know, tens of thousands of people have come to Plum Village on retreats. They've never administered a survey in their entire life. Never, like never had. We're just going to ask people on something before and after. And it reminded me of another really, you know, great example of guy. I was doing a lot of stuff with the guy, Ben Goldacre. I don't know, he does a bad pharma. He's more like has it in for the pharmaceutical and science. He quite does write to the Guardian and stuff. But he had this great idea for what I called randomized me. So his idea there was you could do massive scale pharmaceutical trials on things that people know are already pretty safe, but you just don't know like how effective like this ibuprofen versus, I don't know, paracetamol is. You could just get your doctor to randomize you. You know, you could just have loads of GPs sign up. And, you know, I just think people are doing huge amounts of different practices out in this world at the moment, right? For various forms of growth. And we're capturing no information. You know, like it would be so, you know, Martin does tell a lovely story about that. Like he started out at the beginning of the thing, going to lots of teachers saying, hey, can I do some stuff? And he was like, it was like he brought a flamethrower in the room. People did not like the idea most of the time that he was going to go and actually assess the effectiveness of their programs. But that's a different discussion. But, you know, I just want to come, what I'm getting at is like, for me, it's going to blow me away that Martin, this area of waking up, you think was almost the least tractable, was getting a lot of mileage out of his 10 or 15 years of just like relatively rigorous academic thing out of it. And I was just like, hey, what about, you know, if I just crudely, and I don't think these are well-defined domains, that was my point about a factor analysis earlier, but let's say you said for growing up, So, I look at spiral dynamics, I'm like, I can't find much empirical data. There are these lovely colors suggested, but you mention that to an academic, I'll tell you, I've mentioned it to a series, they will laugh you out of town.
Well, and I can tell you because, after 3 days of standing at the front of the room and lecturing and priming us, Don Beck gives us this really wimpy survey to fill out that says, you have 100 points and you fill it out on each question according to, you can allot some to the different memes. And he said, and he collects them and says, wow, we have a lot of second-tier people in the room. That's great. And I was like, oh God, come on.
Right. So what I'm trying to say is what I think is a research, I guess the research program I'm committed to for the next 30 years or whatever is, hey, can we identify, or I don't need to do it, but can we find people where we've got different areas, like Martin went and did it in Waking Up, or it's even a subdomain. It will turn out as we get the nuance of like language, I'm not claiming that's done one area, but these different areas, and start to be like, we've got a map and then we've got graphs, like, okay, the thing that so resonates about spiral dynamics, even if the thing is a bit crude and you can't mention to anyone respectable, is there's something in that. This feels like there's some juice in that sense of an evolution in worldview. It's like that there is some sense of expansion or changes that are correlated.
Sure, there's a teleos to life.
Well, whether there's a teleos, because I don't know whether but there's what I meant is even if it wasn't a linear direction, there is a map, right? It's like French people are different than Germans. Again, I love the cultural guys recently. There's a lovely data, the other guy like Henrich at Harvard, just 1 second. I kind of come see George, you're right. I have to go to the building site. But 1 second at the end, which is like, I'm coming, I promise. This last one is they took a bunch of Facebook data of like, I think it was, what you like doing as a sport or like as a hobby. They just got a lot of data and they just said, let's just do pure statistical analysis to group people. And guess what? Borders are real in that sense, culturally. Germans and French like doing really, you can, without knowing someone's French or German, you can 95% classify them based on their tastes on Facebook. Those things about, that's the future, I think, of culturology, is we have really much more fine-grained, high-dimensional data. You can see a lot of information. You could see what I call cultural genetics, which is the holy grail, right? What does cultural evolution actually look like?
Jonathan and I were delivering programs in organizations, large organizations on culture.
Right. I mean, imagine you could capture data over, like, got these social surveys in Europe, but they're often not repetitive to the same person. Some of them are the ones when I was an economist, but, they're not so focused. But imagine you had fine-grained data on like 1 million people over time. You could really see like cultural evolution happening in people's attitudes about things, richer than we've had in the world value survey and things like that, much more at that level. Anyway, I'm getting so excited that everyone has left, but I just want to say,
Lauren has stuck it out.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. I mean, I have such a obviously I'm limited a bit with my 3.5-year-old and things, but this is absolutely something I am really, really interested in.
Lauren, any closing words?
Yeah. Thank you for coming so much.
No, it's been very interesting though to listen, so thank you very much.
Great.
But I'm always curious what the quiet people are thinking, though. It's always the most interesting.
Yes, probably so. I mean, I think the other tip I have for myself.
Yeah, but you're not the quiet one.
What I know, I think the other thing I say, because I'm quite familiar with this stuff, is it's very abstract. Unless we give concrete examples, when I first come across it, I'm like, it took me like quite a few hours to be like, what are these like levels of abstraction about like truth meaning or something, like, that's another one. But you're right, I'm not a quiet one, at least for today.
Well, to be continued. I mean, would be just fabulous to